So about a year ago, I made this lounge chair, and at the time, I was really happy with it, but it turned out to be pretty uncomfortable, and it had a few other problems with it. And ever since then, I've really wanted to remake it, but to do it properly. So in this video, I'm going to take what I learnt from making that chair, and I'm going to make a brand new chair, but much better. So I'm going to be making this chair out of these two pieces of walnut, and I picked them up quite cheaply from a local furniture manufacturer who were essentially getting rid of them. They've both got quite a lot of defects in them. They've got knots and quite a lot of sapwood, and one of them's obviously been removed from another table because it's full of dominoes and biscuits. But I'm happy to work around all of this. Walnut's walnut, and it's still quite a lot nicer than the wood that I usually get to work with. As I haven't got a huge amount of this wood to work with, I'm trying to be pretty careful with my layout. And initially I was trying to work around the sapwood to try and keep a bit of colour uniformity, but it was almost impossible, so I ended up just sort of leaning into it. So the first stage of this build is to cut all the blanks out to their rough shape. As I've got to mill everything to its final thickness, I'm just sort of roughly cutting it all out here. I could definitely have milled everything as bigger pieces, but because different parts of the chair are going to be different thicknesses, I just thought it would be safer to do it this way. Now that I've got my blanks all to the correct thickness, I can head back to the table saw and cut all the leg bases to the correct angle. Once I have all the leg bases cut to the right angle, I head over to the jointer and make sure that all these back parts are nice and flat. In terms of the design of this chair, I essentially just took the design from the first chair and made a few tweaks to just improve its comfort and make it look a little bit better. The first chair just looked a bit stubby and the seating position was a little bit too upright, which was just a bit uncomfortable. It's sometimes a bit frustrating, but I found personally I almost always have to build a prototype when I'm making a chair. It's really hard to get everything right in the first go, and I also find it particularly hard to judge how comfortable something's going to be from the design alone. I think that's probably why a chair is thought of sort of as a woodworker's holy grail, because no other furniture really has to worry about being comfortable. So I'm cutting the cross rail here that goes between the front and the back legs, and usually I'd cut the angle on something like this with some sort of sled, but I didn't have any spare MDF or plywood lying around, so I made this little stop block that goes against the fence, which actually turned out to be a bit of a dumb idea. Well, the idea was okay, the execution was bad, and here's the moment I realised that I'd cut my piece too short. So after a few swear words, I fixed up this little stop block, remilled some more wood, and thankfully this worked this time, but unfortunately I got my bits of wood mixed up and I cut this out of my leg blank, so I had to go back and cut another leg blank, which was quite frustrating. Anyway, after all that faff around, I was able to get the template traced back onto my leg blanks, and this time I'm cutting much closer to the line as I'm preparing to template route them. And as always, I'm using the humble double-sided sticky tape to keep all this attached. In terms of learning woodworking, I've really cut my teeth on Australian hardwoods and particularly recycled woods, which are really beautiful timbers, but they're quite difficult to work with at times. They're really splintery and super hard, and routing them in a situation like this is oftentimes quite sketchy because things just grab and splinter and break off, so I was really appreciating working with such a nice wood on this project. So for joinery on this one, I'm going to be using the domino. I've noticed the hatred towards this machine has dropped off a little bit recently, which is interesting, but it really is just a fantastic tool and just allows me to work through projects so much quicker. So during this glue up, I probably should have used an angled block here to help apply proper pressure, but I just used a couple of clamps and the flexibility of the heads worked fine. Once these have dried, I can cut the top to its final length, and I'm cutting them stacked on top of each other, so when I cut the top one, it leaves a little mark on the bottom, and then I can come along and cut the bottom one to its final length. And this was just an easy way of making sure that they both came out the same length. Annoyingly, this one here had a bit of a dodgy finish, so I just came along afterwards and cleaned it up off camera. I can now move on to the armrests, which is both the most enjoyable but also the most time-consuming part of this build. There's a few stages to getting these armrests shaped properly, and I'm cutting the profile out here. And I'll keep the offcuts of these just so that I can stick them back on afterwards, so that I can cut the shape on the top. So I can stick those offcuts back on temporarily, which just gives me a nice square piece of wood which allows me to cut this top profile on the armrest. The design of these armrests are another area of improvement over the first chair, which had quite sort of upright and not that comfortable armrests. And once I've got the rough shape cut out at the bandsaw, I can take this across to my bench and start spoke shaving away to refine the shape. And here I was having another appreciation for this wood. It just spoke shaved so nicely. This whole process is a real exercise in feel. I know what I want these to look like, but I've got no template really or any roadmap, and it's just a process of gradually carving these down till I like the way that they look. Before I shape this armrest to its final shape, I need to attach it to the legs whilst I've still got some flat reference faces. And to attach it, I'll be using dowels and this little dowel jig that I made a while ago. These holes are a little bit off center, but that'll be fine. Now that I've got the armrest attached to the legs, I can really start refining the shape. That starts at the spindle sander, where I can just ease the transition between the armrest and the legs, and then back to the hand tools. To get the rounded profiles on the inside of these joints, I'm using this rounded rasp. This particular one's called an Izukawa carving file, and it's one of my favourite tools. Obviously this is very sped up footage, but it just cuts incredibly quickly. It's got these tiny little teeth that are almost like plane blades. There was a lot of this process that I didn't film, but it was really time consuming. There was quite a lot of looking down the lengths of the arms just to sort of tell how they're both looking against each other. And even though it took a really long time to get them looking right, it was a really enjoyable process. Once I'd finished dealing with the armrests, I headed over to the router table to put a round over on the rest of the legs. And I had to use my hand router to do the round over on the outside of the legs because the bulge of the armrest meant that it didn't sit flat on the router table. And just some more hand tool work on those bits that the routers couldn't reach. Now that the legs are done, I can move on to the seat and the backrest, and for that I'm going to be using this piece that's full of the dominoes and the biscuits. So another improvement that I'm making over the first chair is the total width of the chair. The first one that I made was too narrow. It sort of felt like you're sitting in a roller coaster seat. So this one ended up being about 56 centimeters wide. You could definitely go a little bit wider than that, but it's just a much more comfortable sitting position. For joinery on the seat rest and the backrest, I'm going to be using bridle joints. I feel like pretty much every project that I do has a bridle joint somewhere in it. I just really like how they look. They're quite easy to cut and they're just really strong. So this starts out by hogging out all the material for the style, and then after using a test piece to get the blade in the right spot, I can cut out the rails. And it's always pretty satisfying to cut the shoulders off these joints. And the test fits are also super satisfying. For the backrest, I'm going to be cutting some slats that will slot into some domino holes. So I'm essentially just cutting really long dominoes. And this is that piece that I cut too short earlier that was meant to be the cross rail, so thankfully that's not going to complete waste. After cutting everything to the correct size at the table saw, it's off to the router table and they all got a round over with a 5mm bit, which gives it the 10mm diameter that I'm after. And these only need a little dab of glue in there. They're not really holding anything together, it's just more to stop them sliding around. I'm just using clamps here to bring these joints together, and then once it's all nicely seated, I can take them off and get on with the rest of the glue up. Once these are finished drying, I'm flashing off the joints at the router table. I prefer to do it this way than to use the sander, just because when you're sanding thin pieces like this, it's quite easy to rock the sander backwards and forwards and just round over that nice crisp joint, which I don't want to do. I'm going to cut a bevel on the seat and the backrest, and this dictates the lean of the backrest, and 10 degrees is a fairly standard angle for this. Another fairly big design shift from the first seat to this one is replacing solid seat slats with elastic webbing. A fairly easy way of attaching this webbing to the seat would be to simply staple it, but a much more elegant way is to use these clips, which require you to route a groove all the way around the seat base. And I think there's a pretty good reason you don't see solid seat slats on a lot of the old mid-century lounge chairs. It's just not that comfortable. So I'm no seat professional, and obviously you can use softer foam if you want to use a slatted seat design, but I had my cushions professionally made by a local upholstery company, and they highly suggested that I use a high density foam, which is what I'd used in my previous chair as well. And I just really think you need the extra sponginess of the elastic just to have that full luxurious experience, which is what you want when you're sitting in a seat like this. So to attach the seat base to the seat back, again, I'm using the domino. And because I've cut the 10-degree bevel on it, I've lost my flat reference face. So I'm just leveling it up with the top of the workbench here so that I've got something for the domino to rest on. At this point I can do a dry assembly, and this is partly just to see what it looks like, but also to add some little marks to add dominoes to attach the seat assembly to the leg assembly. And again, I'm using the workbench here just as a flat surface for the domino to lean on. I put a small radius on all of the corners just to take the sharp edge off. And then I can glue the seat base to the seat back. And for this glue up, I've got an offcut which is cut to 10 degrees, which just helps apply the correct clamping pressure. Whilst that dried, I did some final sanding on the arms and legs. Again, I'm only showing a small amount of this process, but I spent a really long time sanding. I feel like when you're sitting in a seat like this, you're always sort of touching it and rubbing your hands along it, so I really wanted to do a thorough job just to make sure that there weren't any little imperfections anywhere. And before I do my final glue up, I'm going to pre-finish everything. Because I've spent so much time sanding, I really don't want to have to deal with any glue squeeze out, and it's just much easier to clean something that's been pre-oiled. And I'm also pretty impatient to see what this will look like with a bit of oil on it, which I thought was looking pretty nice. I will be doing another coat of oil once everything's been glued up. This is more just being added as a pure protective measure. And I always love this process of putting oil on a bridle joint. So I'm gluing the dominoes in here, and I think what I should have done and what I will do in the future is just glue the dominoes in, wait for them to dry, and then glue the rest of it together. I really don't think you need to put glue in between. It's not really necessary. The dominoes themselves are what's holding everything together, and when I was doing this, it was a bit of a warm day and everything started to go off too quickly, so it was just a bit of a stressful glue up. But I was really happy that I pre-finished everything. The cleanup of the glue squeeze out was really easy. To attach the seat uprights to the legs, I'm going to be just using a screw. And here I'm drilling an oversized hole that I can come along and fill with the dowel afterwards. And here I'm epoxying in a brass dowel, which I think makes a really nice contrast to the walnut. So the final part of this build was to attach this webbing, and there was a little bit of trial and error in terms of how long to cut it. I initially cut these a bit too long, so they were a bit too spongy, but I eventually sort of found a sweet spot in terms of how tight to make them. It's pretty easy to attach this webbing to these little clips. All you have to do is essentially squeeze the clips shut. It was a little bit of a fiddle to do this by hand. I think there's a tool which allows you to pull this webbing, but it's definitely possible just to do it with your hands. And this gives a rough indication of how tight these ended up being. And after adding some cushions and giving everything a final wax buff with some steel wool, the chair was done.